I'll just do a quick intro. Bethany,
Okay.
you have the time to do the
Great. Okay.
quick arrangement.
Sounds good.
Okay, so hi again, everyone, and Eid Mubarak again. Welcome to GAJA's Graduate Student Colloquium event of Spring 2023. My name is Hatice Öztürk, for those who don't know me, and I'm the treasurer of GAJA, and I will be serving as the moderator today. You will be hearing a presentation from Bethany Weppler on stylistic variation among Egyptian newscasters, followed by a response by Dr. Emma Trentman. I wish to send a warm welcome to Bethany and Dr. Emma Trentman. Before we get started, I would like to inform you that the event will be recorded and uploaded to our department's YouTube channel, so you can have access to it later as well. So now let me introduce you Bethany and Dr. Trentman. Bethany is a graduate student at the Arabic and Islamic Studies Department at Georgetown, specializing in Arabic linguistics. Her primary research interests include sociophonetics and intra- and interpersonal speaker variation, in addition to diagnosis in North Africa. Oh, sorry, Oh yeah, okay, I'm recording now. Okay, that's fine. And Dr. Emma Trentman is an associate professor of Arabic at the University of New Mexico. She is an applied linguist whose research examines language learning during study abroad, virtual exchange, and in the language classroom, with a focus on language ideologies and multilingual approaches. So now, without further ado, I will give the mic to Bethany. Bethany, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Khadija. All right, let me start with sharing my slides. 1 second, and then presenter view. All right, can everyone see them? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Eid Mubarak to everyone who is celebrating. Thank you for coming to my presentation today. I don't anticipate it to be too long. I know some of you are celebrating and it's also a Friday. So I want you to have a restful and happy Eid. My name is Bethany Weppler, as Khadija mentioned, and I'm a second-year PhD student in Arabic and Islamic Studies, concentrating in Arabic linguistics. And today I will be presenting to you, as the title suggests, Jiim versus Giim, an analysis of stylistic variation among Egyptian newscasters. And before I kind of begin going through my slides, I just want to give you a little bit of a story, a little bit of background about how I came to do this project. So during the pandemic, I was listening to this sociolinguistics podcast as one does, and one of the episodes featured a guest who was a news broadcaster from the US South, and she expressed how she received many comments about her Southern accent as she transitioned from a local, Southern news channel in her state to nationwide news. And so it made me curious about how this would translate within the Egyptian context by looking at newscasters broadcasting on a local level and an international one or pan-Arab one, as Egypt is considered one of the major producers of media for the Arabic-speaking world. And I started this study as a part of a group class project about a year ago, and I've expanded it since then. So I also just want to acknowledge my original group mates, Charlie Body and Jun Fang, for their help with starting this research project. And then one last thing I want to preface is that since I've submitted this abstract for this colloquium, I have been working on the project some more. So the results you'll be seeing today will differ from the results in the abstract, which originally focused only on male newscasters at the time, but now I have included female newscasters as part of the overall sample. So I can more confidently illustrate a holistic view of the behaviors of Egyptian newscasters overall. And finally, if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. All right, so moving on, allow me to give you a brief background on Egyptian Arabic. Egyptian Arabic may be most recognizable by its use of Giim, instead of the standard variant J or Jiim, which is represented orthographically by this Jiim here. There are obviously occurrences of G in other dialects, however, they occur in different environments. For example, in place of the unvoiced uvular plosive qa. As for the history of Giim within Egypt, Egypt's G stems from a phonological development. Voidish and Zach, 2009, discussed that classical Arabic actually used to have Giim, but over time, its articulation moved further to the front. And I mean, some Egyptians try to claim that they had the original Giim from classical Arabic, but the use of Egyptian G appears to have emerged sometime in the 17th century and became really well established by the 19th and 20th centuries. So in reality, Egyptian Arabic is actually backing the J's and essentially cycling back rather than preserving the original Giim from classical Arabic. As for more of like a social context, Egypt is known within the Arabic-speaking world as a dominant producer of Arabic media. And since the dawn of radio broadcasting and television, Egypt has been a major contributor to media in the Arabic-speaking world and has therefore gained a reputation as such. Also, there's a reason why Lebanese singer Nancy Ajram or Agram sings in Egyptian Arabic rather than her native Lebanese dialect, which is just a reflection of the prominence of Egyptian media across the Arabic-speaking world. Not to mention, when you're listening to the news in Arabic, it's sometimes very easy to point out which newscaster is Egyptian or not, because on occasion you would hear like a G here and there in place of J. So due to these social and linguistic reasons, we will be adopting the socio-phonetic variant Jiim to represent the variation among Egyptian newscasters. And so when I'm specifically talking about the sociolinguistic variant, I will say Jiim, and then for the phonetic features, I'll say G versus J, just for clarification. And if you've seen the show The Good Place, the actress Jamila Jamil, I found a really funny tweet saying the Egyptian urge to call Jamila Jamil Gamila Gamil, just to kind of show you, how significant the G is in Egyptian Arabic. So when I was trying to look into the literature for a correlation between Jiim and Egyptian Arabic, there really wasn't a lot available. However, there is previous research on the linguistic variable Jiim generally in Arabic. For example, Al-Wer et al. 2020 find that there are many social pressures to conform to a prestigious version of one's dialect in the Gulf. So, and when we talk about prestige, it's a very complex concept in linguistics and specifically Arabic linguistics, as it does not always index the standard, but rather a variety that's maybe valued over another due to several social factors. And in this case, the prestige variety is Jiim used, or the version of Jiim used in the workplace or an educational setting, or like in urban centers. In some areas in Saudi Arabia, for example, in the study that I mentioned, the target is the standard J versus the colloquial ya. And in some instances, ya was marked among younger generations as like non-Saudi, especially among families who previously immigrated from another Gulf state. They tried to conform using the J variety versus ya to conform to the Saudi in-group. That's to say, speakers of Arabic dialects, not just within Egypt, will change their Jiim depending on the groups and identity markers they wish to associate with. And then this kind of brings up the question of, what does this look like within a different sort of sphere? for example, producers and media and TV personalities, and whether they would feel similarly or feel the social pressure to converge to the standard or a prestigious variety, or diverge and use their own variety of language. So in order to do that, we're going to be using the framework of Bell 2001, who deals with audience design and convergence, which talks about how a speaker performs linguistically as a response to the type of audience they are addressing, which also goes hand in hand with Giles et al.'s 1975 accommodation theory, where which states people will behave similarly to those around them to be perceived more positively. And in this case, the behavior that we'll be examining is more specifically linguistic behavior. And also, prior research does show that topic and audience are significant factors for code switching, which Edin 2014 discusses in his article on Egyptian Arabic speakers. However, this study was more of a discourse analysis, and the one we'll be observing is more phonetic. So I'm trying to fill sort of a gap here today. So ultimately, all this research brought up the question about newscasters from Egypt and how they present themselves linguistically depending on audience, which also leads us to our research question: is there a systematic relationship between audience design and how Egyptian newscasters pronounce Jiim? And to examine this research question, we have to state two main hypotheses. First is our null hypothesis, that there is no systematic relationship between audience design and how Egyptian newscasters utter Jiim. And then there's also our alternative hypothesis, which states that there is a systematic relationship between audience design and how Egyptian newscasters utter Jiim. And we set our alpha, which is this number down here, and we will compare it to our p-value later. It is set at 0.05, since this is exploratory research, which doesn't have very high stakes, and since it doesn't have very high stakes and allows for a larger margin of error. All right, so in terms of variables, we'll be examining types of audience and number of newscasters using J. Our independent variable, or IV, is audience type, which will be examined on two levels: Egyptian versus international news, or Egyptian/local versus international news, meaning like more directed towards a pan-Arab audience. And then since the variable itself does not have any numerical value, it is measured on a nominal scale. And then as for our dependent value, or DV, it will be the number of newscasters uttering J. And it also has two levels. The first one being between 0 and 5 utterances of J, and the second one being is 5 or greater utterances of J, which is also going to be on a nominal scale. Now, I chose to observe the standard variety over the colloquial one, as the expectation is for speakers of Egyptian Arabic to utter G as it is part of their native dialect, which is sort of an assumption based on Egyptian Arabic's prominence in media, since, like I mentioned earlier, there really hasn't been a lot of prior research on the subject. Now, as for our speakers, I gathered a list of 38 newscasters. They consisted of 19 newscasters broadcasting in local Egyptian channels and 19 international / pan-Arab channels. All newscasters were from Egypt, and we also further controlled this group for gender, where 20 newscasters were men and 18 were women, just to examine and see if there was a difference in gender. These are also evenly distributed by channel type. And so also regarding the sample of women, video clips of newscasters are not extremely accessible through like tagging systems. So I only managed to find 9 women per audience type. And then the approximate age range among all of them is 25 to 70. And in order to quote unquote recruit the sample, some names were gathered by word of mouth. I would just reach out to some friends and they would give me a list of people to look up. And then I also referred to a couple of Wikipedia lists of Egyptian like إعلاميين or مذيعين, and the feminine equivalents of that, so إعلاميات or مذيعات. And I would then read their biographies to determine which channels they worked for, to see, you know, what their intended audience usually was. And also looked up clips of them on YouTube, as the search functions on most news channel websites do not tag the names of their newscasters. So it's actually, they're very hard to find. So as for our data collection, I listened to 10 minutes of a news segment per newscaster. And then I counted all the utterances of G and J occurring in the video and organized the list by timestamp, and also by which variety was spoken and by which words these tokens occurred in. I also then converted the tallies into a chi-square table with the focus on the amount of J being uttered per newscaster. And to do all the statistics and stuff, I used SPSS version 29 for my to do all of this. So once all the data was collected, I converted the tallies in descriptive tables. So here you can see the tallies of G versus J among the male newscasters. From these tables alone, you can see that there is some sort of accommodation happening, where male international newscasters appear to use J more than the local group. As you can see, there's very little occurrences of J, whereas in the international one, there's a lot more accommodation happening. It also appears it's more of like an either or situation, where in many cases, once a newscaster speaks one variety of Jiim, they stick to it for the remainder of the video. And then here we have the women's tallies. From first observation, we see that in the local table, there is no J whatsoever, none. It's important to note that when I was counting these tokens, the instances of J that did occur in these videos were either borrowings or names. And since those aren't really susceptible to a lot of variation, I had to get rid of them, which left us with no instances of J whatsoever. And then for the international group, we see a lot more variation, where it looks like there are only 2 women, so numbers 3 and 9, who use J less than 5 times. And then other than that, everyone predominantly uses J. Now we're coming to the exciting part, statistics. I know this is not everyone's favorite thing, but I've a list of the chi-square assumptions on the left here, as these tests need to meet certain requirements for validity. I won't get into too much detail about this, but it's there for your reference. And then if we turn our attention to the chi-square table on the right, this is the results for all of the newscasters combined. We see that the columns are separated by audience type, and then and the rows are separated by the number of occurrences of J. So we have here less than 5, and then equal to or more or equal to 5 occurrences of Jiim. And then within the tables, we see that there are 17 local newscasters who used Jiim less than 5 times, while 2 did more or equal to 5. On the international side, we see that there are 6 of them who uttered Jiim less than 5 times, and 13 newscasters uttered Jiim more or equal to 5 times. This leads us to a p-value of 0.00026, which is way less than our set alpha of 0.05, meaning that there is a significant systematic relationship between audience type and the number of utterances of Jiim. And so, in addition to the entire group, while my main research question is more focused on the entire sample, I also wanted to see if there were any significant differences between male and female newscasters. And so from this table of male newscasters, we can observe that there are less occurrences of Jiim within the local group and slightly more in the international group. However, this does not necessarily signify a systematic relationship between audience type and the number of occurrences of Jiim, as the p-value here is 0.068 and our alpha is 0.05, and it's close, but it's not necessarily close enough to say there is a systematic difference. As for the women, we see a similar pattern, but it's a little more extreme. It appears that the female group accommodates more according to audience than men. This is backed up by our p-value of 0.00071. But I do want to clarify that typically these chi-square tests do have a requirement of having each cell filled, depending on the amount of variables you are testing, which in this case is 5. However, since the available sample size was only 18, it's not really possible to fill them all. So that might also explain the small p-value. Just to telling you to take this result with a grain of salt, but we do see some sort of, some sort of difference happening here. And then, as we mentioned a couple slides ago in our overall sample, our p-value was 0.00026, and that means we can reject our null hypothesis, indicating that there is a 95% certainty that there is a systematic relationship between audience design and Jiim. And then, and moving on to our next slide. These results lead to a couple of implications that Egyptian newscasters do accommodate according to the type of audience they address, as we would expect from previous research like Bell 2001 and Giles et al. 1975. This may be primarily driven by women, as they seem to exhibit a significant systematic relationship between audience type and pronouncing the standard variant. And this can be backed up with previous research, like in Bethany 2010, who conducted a discourse analysis related to differences between Egyptian male and female talk show hosts. And she found a relationship between code choice and identity, and also found that educated women tend to use MSA in the public sphere more than men, just to assert their dominance or assert their identities, indicating that, I come from this educated background and I want to show that. And then in terms of men, on the other hand, they appear less likely to accommodate according to audience type and tend to prefer the colloquial variant G. Now we come to address a couple of limitations to the study. First, I want to address that news clips of specific newscasters were a bit difficult to find. Sorry, 1 second. This is partially due to the fact that not many clips tag newscasters with their names. Additionally, many of the clips were interviews or a talk show format consisting of an outside party, which may also sway which variant of Jiim is being pronounced as the role of the audience changes to more of a secondary auditor rather than a primary one. I also, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the statistical test that I used, one of the assumptions in chi-square tests is that each cell must be filled with at least 5 newscasters. However, the sample available is small and cannot realistically reach that number. This is especially limiting when observing gender differences, since there weren't 20 women available to count tokens for. However, it does give a relatively good picture of how audience design works given the sample size available, and we also see in some previous research that there does seem to be some sort of gender differences in terms of accommodating and indexing identity. There's also the question of how much this is conscious versus unconscious, since many people are either reading off of notes or teleprompters, and every news station has a different set of standards of how their newscasters present themselves. Like in the podcast episode that I mentioned earlier, featuring the newscaster in the South, she felt that there was a lot of pressure for her to conform to a more Midwestern accent as she moved from her local Southern channel to national TV. And this is but this is rather hard to judge without a personal interview or a focus group, but it's definitely something to consider. And then this kind of study has some implications for future research. While I was watching the videos, I couldn't help but notice how other sounds characteristic to Egyptian Arabic would vary, while Jiim would not. So some of these are like qaf and va, so like and za. So it would be interesting to measure how in registered one phonetic feature is to another. It would also be interesting to look at other sources of media like political speeches or radio shows to see how the variation of Jiim differs, and also control more for topic and things like that. And then additionally, it would be interesting to conduct a comparative study using the same sociolinguistic variables in a different Arabic dialect. For example, Lebanese Arabic does not have the d part of j, so they just say j. And from what people tell me, that is a very important distinction and also something closely tied to Lebanese identity. And finally, thank you. This concludes my presentation on Egyptian newscasters and audience design. I'd like to thank you again for listening to my presentation, especially on Eid Mubarak. I will take any questions that you have. And before I conclude, if you have any video clips, any news clips in Egyptian Arabic, for local or international, please send them to me, and my email's on screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bethany, for this very informative presentation. Before hearing the audience, I would like to welcome Dr. Emma Trentman to hear about her thoughts, and then we can welcome the audience for their questions or comments.
All right, thank you so much. Eid Mubarak to everyone. I'm very impressed with the turnout today, and thank you to Bethany for such a wonderful and interesting talk. I think you did a great job of, taking into consideration the different audiences and how to find the clips, and considering gender differences and relating it to the previous research. And certainly your findings parallel what I've read and also experienced listening to newscasters. And so I wanted to comment on a few things. I mean, you mentioned that there seemed to be, for most of the broadcasters, an either or pattern. So either they went with Giim or they went with Jiim, and there wasn't a lot of variation. And I wanted to ask, but there were a few that did seem to vary more than the others. And so I wanted to, I have a series of questions, but the first one is just if you noticed anything different about those clips in terms of the audience or the broadcaster themselves that you thought might lead to that sort of more actual variation.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and also thank you for that question. It's actually, yeah, it's a very good question. When I was watching these clips, I think that type of variation might have been a little less conscious than it definitely wasn't a conscious choice to use Giim over Jiim or one variant over the other. While I think in other clips where it was more of an either or situation, as soon as they started saying Giim, it's just Giim throughout. You're never going to hear Ja ever again. So I think it's just kind of one of those accidental sort of slips, where it's like you say Ga and then maybe you catch yourself, or maybe it's and then you're like, oh yeah, I have to go back or something like that. So the Ga slips in unconsciously, and then consciously you're like, oh, I need to switch. And that could be driven by certain standards of the news channel or otherwise.
Well, thank you. And so I have two more questions that are related to that. One was, you'd mentioned that you took out words that were loan words or names and so wouldn't vary. But I did wonder if there were any lexical effects or words that were more likely that you noticed to be Giim or Jiim. This is something that's come up in my research with Arabic learners. And so I was just wondering if in the broadcasters you saw any similarities.
Yeah, so a lot of clips that were about like economics, the currency in Egypt, is the Egyptian pound, and so the word guinea would show up, and so I'd have to get rid of guinea, and because it would just really mess with the token counting overall, and that one would not change whatsoever. And also like names, and also it's like there are some sort of words that like Inglizia, which sometimes do change to Ingilizia, but the switch is not as common. So those are also words that I sort of looked out for. So like the currency, or like just common words that that I like, high frequency words that are just so often used that there's no chance of them switching.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the final question I had was about, you mentioned, and this relates to sort of the example you gave about the podcaster from the South. So you mentioned that you had looked into, when you were identifying the broadcasters, you'd found that they were Egyptian. And so certainly Giim is a dominant marker of Egyptian Arabic, but the sort of the prestigious urban variety. And I wondered if any of the broadcasters were actually from other regions of Egypt where they might say Jiim or Jiim, and if you thought that might have any sort of effect on your data, either in terms of them feeling that pressure to accommodate to Giim, or perhaps then changing it into an international variety.
Definitely. When I first started this project, I tried to look at newscasters who were primarily from and in Cairo. But then when I expanded more, when I expanded the data more, I couldn't really keep that control. But I do think most people are either from Alexandria or Cairo. So yeah, and a lot of the background information I got was from like their Wikipedia pages or Instagram profiles, and you know, sometimes they don't necessarily indicate that. They're just like, this is an Egyptian newscaster, and that's about it. But my judging from listening to them, it sounds like more Cairo and Alexandria.
Mhm. Well, thank you. I want to
Yeah.
make sure everyone else has an opportunity to ask questions, but I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think it has a lot of potential for future work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tretman and Bethany. That was a very enriching talk. We can now have the questions from the audience.